quarter century, Mao Zedong was China's absolute ruler. When he died, few could imagine China without him.
My neighbor said, "What is China going to do? We've lost direction. Heaven is collapsing."
With Mao's death, a new era began, with new leaders, new visions, and a dramatic new course for the Chinese people. Never in the history of the world has a nation been transformed with such speed and magnitude. This was communism's new revolution. In 1976, when Mao died, China was a poor country, largely isolated from the rest of the world. A quarter century of communism had failed to bring prosperity to the Chinese people. Mao's vision of the path to communism had been one of continual revolution. He had interrupted periods of growth and calm with one turbulent political campaign after another. In the last decade of his rule, he had launched the Cultural Revolution and brought China to disaster. Mao's most fanatic supporters, millions of teenage Red Guards, followed his orders to attack their teachers, intellectuals, Communist Party officials, even their own families. Few escaped the violence.
To educate the masses, people who were going to be executed were put on public display and tortured. It felt like a ritual sacrifice. You were the goat put on the altar. I was the main target, and my father and brother were brought to watch. I could hear people shouting, "Shoot him." The pain from seeing my father below was deeper than any physical pain I suffered.
During this period, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and three of her colleagues, later called the Gang of Four, gained great power. They pushed the Cultural Revolution to its most brutal extremes. When Mao saw that China was on the brink of civil war, he turned on the Red Guards. He ordered them to leave their homes in the cities and move to the countryside to be educated by the peasants. These young people became known as sent-down youth.
Many people were shocked after they got to northern Anhui and saw what it was like. There was nothing there except a few grass huts. The people ate sorghum that was hard as iron. It was awful. We really didn't want to be assigned there for the rest of our lives.
Once a brigade official said to me, "Both you and your sister are staying here. Stop dreaming about leaving the countryside." I couldn't sleep the whole night after hearing him. I cried and cried as if I had gone mad.
Millions of young people lost years of education and family life laboring in the countryside. By the time of Mao's death, many were relieved.
His policies had brought so much suffering and catastrophe to China. So I thought that Mao's time was finally over, and it was high time.
The unknown Hua Guofeng was Mao's official successor, but his position was far from secure. Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, together with her allies, posed the most immediate threat to his power. Less than a month after Mao's death, in a move that thrilled the country, Hua Guofeng arrested the Gang of Four.
People hated them very much. It was only because they had Mao's favor and protection that they reached such high positions. After Mao's death, they lost power. There is a saying in Chinese, when the big tree falls down, all the monkeys run away.
People went to buy crabs. They bought one female crab, which symbolized Jiang Qing, and 3 male ones, which symbolized the rest of the Gang of Four. Everyone was joking around like that. Every family went to the store and bought 4 crabs, which they tied up and held on a string. They would wave the crabs at friends to say hello. And then they took the crabs home and cooked them.
We Chinese called this our second liberation. Everyone was really happy about it.
With his immediate rivals disposed of, Hua Guofeng worked to strengthen his position.
I saw Hua Guofeng several times at meetings. The impression he gave me was that he was doing his best to imitate Mao Zedong, like the way he walked and the way he talked.
Hua had an historic opportunity, but unfortunately he didn't seize it. Soon after he arrested the Gang of Four in October, I was informed of his instructions that every word by Mao must be followed.
It was the same old way of talking. I saw an editorial in the Beijing Daily, which had a line that really amazed me. We must obey Chairman Hua the way we did Chairman Mao. And we must love Chairman Hua the way we love Chairman Mao. I was so shocked that I started shouting, "How can they write stuff like this?" A colleague poked me with his pen and said, "Stop." Chairman Hua himself approved this editorial. I never had much hope for him after that.
Hua Guofeng soon faced another powerful rival, the tough, resilient Deng Xiaoping. At 72 years old, Deng was a veteran revolutionary, one who put economic prosperity before socialist purity. For this, he had twice been purged by Mao.
Of course, he believed in socialism, but he didn't think socialism was dogma. He had a famous saying, "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white," he said, "as long as it catches mice." He encouraged everyone to concentrate on results, to see if what they were doing was good for the country.
Deng was a pragmatist, but he also believed in the absolute authority of the Communist Party. Without it, he thought, China would splinter apart and slip into chaos. Deng appeared in public for the first time since Mao's death in July 1977 at a soccer match in Beijing. The venue was symbolic. In this stadium, the Gang of Four had led thousands in rallies against him during the Cultural Revolution. Deng moved skillfully to consolidate his power. His first step was to mobilize the party to exonerate the millions of people like himself who had been attacked during the Cultural Revolution. Ge Yang had spent 22 years in exile and labor camps.
When I returned to Beijing, they told us the charges had been made in error. My God, for those 22 years I was a rightist and a counter-revolutionary, and it was all a mistake. Those 22 years were really hard, but I started a new life.
The problem was whether you could cooperate with the people who had attacked you. We returned to our old jobs with the same old people. Society had to go on. We could still work for many years. So I agreed to take back my old job. I had no choice.
Throughout China, the scars of Mao's rule ran deep. The children of his revolution, especially the sent-down youth, were a generation unlike any other. Shaped by the traumas of the Cultural Revolution and their years in the countryside, they began to return home.
My friends and I did not know what to believe. Even if we could come back to Beijing, and in fact I was transferred to Beijing in 1979 after 2 years of great efforts. But even if we could return and find jobs, we still felt we had been wronged, that something had been taken away from us.
When I came to Beijing, I felt that the city was full of profound changes. Everyone felt that something historically significant was going to happen. Quite a few salons sprang up, where people talked about politics. Everyone was having big debates about where the country was going.
In the autumn of 1978, the debate spilled onto the street, to an area in western Beijing which became known as Democracy Wall. People came and pasted up writings, articles, and poems. They wanted to express their anger and sorrow about the Cultural Revolution, and to understand how such a catastrophe could have engulfed the country.
I examined the Cultural Revolution and criticized Mao Zedong directly. This was not party line. I said that Mao did not launch the Cultural Revolution because he made a mistake, but because he was an evil man. I think it was the first time anybody had ever said anything like that about Mao. My speech caused quite a stir.
On November 27, 1978, the People's Daily reported that Deng supported the movement. "We have no intention of denying the right of the people to express their views by putting up wall posters," he was quoted. Deng's words fueled the movement. One of the most outspoken activists was a young electrician and son of a party official, Wei Jingsheng. "The leaders of our nation must be informed that we want to take our destiny into our own hands," he wrote boldly. "Democracy, freedom, and happiness are the only goals of modernization." It was in this heady atmosphere that the Chinese Communist Party met in December 1978. Behind the ritual facade, Deng Xiaoping ousted Hua Guofeng.
It was at the third meeting of the Congress that Deng established his political power. Although he was still a vice chairman, his voice became the party's voice, and his policies were accepted by the whole party.
Deng Xiaoping was now the most powerful man in China. In 1978, the Chinese people lived in almost total isolation from the outside world. For nearly 3 decades under Mao, international relations, especially with America, had been cold and often hostile. Now, China and the U.S. were eager to move forward. At the end of 1978, Americans partied with their Chinese colleagues in a relaxed atmosphere not seen for decades. Under Deng Xiaoping, negotiations for full diplomatic relations were swift. On January 1st, 1979, Ambassador Leonard Woodcock welcomed Deng to the American embassy to celebrate the new relationship.
This had been a long desire on the part of the Chinese to affect normal relations with the United States, so that Deng Xiaoping had made this a major item of his program. He was extremely happy. All the Chinese were.
At the end of January, Deng Xiaoping made an official visit to America.
我们将同美国政府领导人和国家朋友共同探讨发展两国在政治、经济、科技、文化各个领域的交流和合作问题。
Deng was the first Chinese leader ever to visit the U.S.
One of the places he wanted to go was the Space Center in Houston.
Welcome to the training facilities of the astronauts.
Because he has a very curious mind, and he was most anxious to see all he could see. And then they asked him if he'd like to get in the simulator where he'd manipulate the controls. It was though he in fact was in a spaceship bringing it in to a landing.
200 feet. 100 feet.
And the gear are now coming down.
And he was so fascinated by that. They had trouble getting him out, and he just wouldn't move because he was so fascinated with it.
40 feet. 20 feet, Fred.
Deng Xiaoping knew how to live. Deng loved these activities and was happy to go to them. He had a sense of humor. For example, when we went to the rodeo in Texas, everyone was given a hat. Deng got a kick out of wearing it.
Before he made the trip, the Chinese apparently had an inquiry from our State Department, what kind of food should he be served? And the answer that they got was a cautious diplomatic bland food. So the State Department made a decision, there's no blander food than veal. So at the state dinner, he got veal. At every dinner he went to, he got veal. When we got to Atlanta, and Governor Busby, then the governor of Georgia, said to him, "Is there anything about the United States that particularly impresses you, Mr. Vice Premier?" He growled, "Yes, veal at every meal."
Throughout his trip, Deng discussed his ambitious plans to modernize China and make it part of the world economy. One senior American official said everyone who met Deng was amazed at the boldness and sweep of his vision. But Deng's vision did not include political tolerance. By the time he returned to China in February, the Democracy Wall movement had spread to other cities. Posters at the wall began to make serious criticisms of the Communist Party. When activist Wei Jingsheng warned that Deng was becoming a dictator, Deng ordered Wei arrested. In a show trial lasting just one day, Wei was accused of counter-revolution. His outspokenness earned him Deng's personal enmity and a harsh sentence of 15 years in prison. Liu Qing was arrested for handing out copies of the transcript of Wei's trial.
They forced us to sit up straight on small stools. Only after hours in the same position were we allowed to stand up and quickly go to the bathroom. For more than 4 years, I was a vegetable. Except for breathing, they restricted me from moving any part of my body. So I decided to go on a hunger strike. On the 6th day, they force-fed me. They strapped me to a chair while more than 10 people held me down. They squeezed my throat, so I had to open my mouth to breathe. Then they twisted an iron thing into my mouth. It split the corners of my mouth open. Then they used pincers to pull my tongue forward and forced a tube down my throat. They stuffed liquid food into the tube. Food, water, and blood mixed together and went into my stomach. After I had been through all that, I understood the Communist Party better. I wanted to die before, but after this I felt I must survive to let the world know what had happened.
The posters were torn down and their writers intimidated. The journals which had briefly flourished were shut down. One young poet dared to pin a final tribute on the wall. "My friend, parting time is pending. Farewell, Democracy Wall. What can I say to you? Should I speak of spring's frigidity? Should I say you are like the withered winter sweet? No. I should instead talk of happiness, tomorrow's happiness, of pure orchid skies, of golden flowers, of a child's bright eyes. We ought to part with dignity. Don't you agree? For the vast majority of Chinese, the aspirations of the Democracy Wall activists seemed remote. Most people lived in the countryside and were concerned with more basic needs.
Life was extremely difficult. We had nothing but coarse grain to fill our stomachs, and we barely survived. With a family of 10, you had to work hard. We only had a few cents to live on. I mean, that was really hard.
We had to go to work very early in the morning. We had to work for 2 hours on an empty stomach. We ate less than half a pound of rice a day. The men hoed the land while women pulled up the seedlings for transplanting. Everybody had to work. You wouldn't get anything to eat if you didn't. Life was so miserable.
Peasants led regimented lives in large communes. There was little incentive to work harder. Even in a crisis, most of their harvest had to be given to the government. In 1978, there was a devastating drought in Anhui province in central China. Facing starvation, peasants in one village took a bold step. They stopped communal farming and divided the land among the families. Each household worked with new initiative. For after giving their grain quota to the state, they would keep the surplus crop. The farmers knew that people had done this in the past and gone to jail for it. They promised to look after the families of anyone who got into trouble. And they signed an agreement with their fingertips dipped in blood. The risk was worth taking because that year they ate. Local officials sent a representative to Beijing to ask for permission to continue.
In July 1979, an old man, Guo Chunyi, came to Beijing. First he went to the People's Daily, but nobody dared see him. Then he went to the China News Agency, but still no one dared see him. I heard about him and invited him to my group. When he spoke, he stressed that he was pleading for the peasants. I was very moved.
The household responsibility system caused a great debate inside the party. Some senior leaders thought it would upset the whole communist system, but others firmly supported it. They saw it as the only solution to the poverty in China's countryside.
In a monumental decision, Deng's government decided to allow the household responsibility system. Soon after, they disbanded the communes, the main means of communist organization and control in the countryside. In villages around the country, like Shenjiali, many were confused by this dramatic change.
Was this socialism? Was our country still socialist? Was it capitalism? That's what I wondered.
What I was afraid of was there were not enough laborers in my family. My 3 children didn't know how to farm. I was the only one who worked.
Anyway, it was useless to object. It was the government's policy. It was policy. If folks were against it, it was no use, right? Policy is policy.
Under the new system, village after village produced bumper harvests. For centuries, the Chinese people had lived on the edge, facing one famine after another. Now, the average family had enough to eat.
At that time, there was a popular saying among the peasants. Mao Zedong gave us liberation, and Deng Xiaoping has given us food.
Deng wanted to do more than give people food. He wanted to make China a world economic power, to open the entire country to market forces. Working closely with him were innovative leaders Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. Hu Yaobang was Deng's second in command. He had impeccable revolutionary credentials. He had been on the Long March with Mao and Deng. Like Deng, he suffered in the Cultural Revolution. Some joked they were close because Hu was the only member of the Central Committee shorter than the 4'10" Deng.
He was, as we say, a young, old official, because he was one of the youngest of the older generation. When he had a discussion, he treated others as equals. You could express different opinions and he wouldn't criticize you. He was a good listener.
Unlike Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang was not a Red Army veteran, nor a Beijing insider. He had spent his career in the provinces, and he understood the economic realities of rural life. In 1980, Deng decided to use his experience and called him to Beijing.
He tried to make you less nervous. He dressed casually, wearing cotton jackets and cotton shoes. Sometimes when he sat on the sofa, he even took off his shoes and put his feet up, like a northern peasant. He did this to make you feel closer to him, so you would tell him what you really thought.
As Zhao and Hu Yaobang worked to reform the economy, they faced opposition from conservative members of the party who believed the reforms threatened communism itself. In private inter-party meetings, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang argued their case with remarkable frankness.
不管是社会主义国家、各国的党，这个资本主义的国家都是要理人的，不是讲今年的改革这么高和明年的改革这么高，它是要决定我们国家，就是中国这个社会主义经济或者社会主义经济的体制要集中来说一句话呢，就是什么模式我们今天要解决的问题是中国经济、社会主义经济的模式的问题，搞一个纲领性的问题，这个模式的问题。
处在第一线的领导人赵紫阳、胡耀邦
At the top level, Zhao and Hu Yaobang had to report to Deng.
邓小平来请示。从邓小平
Deng
的角
thought,
度来讲，
this is simple.
他觉得这个问题很
If
简
there
单
is a。political problem, I'll
如果
deal
有
with
什么
it.
政治上的困难，我在这里顶。
What are you guys afraid
你们
of?
怕什么？你们只
Just
管
go
往
ahead.
前走好了。
They launched a bold new plan of economic development, designed to attract foreign technology and foreign money. Deng Xiaoping authorized 4 special economic zones in the south, carefully placed near the booming economies of Hong Kong and Taiwan. The farming village of Shenzhen was one. The government brought in electricity, built roads, office buildings, and apartment blocks. They approved policies inconceivable under Mao. Foreign companies were welcomed with financial incentives. They were allowed to use capitalist business methods. For Chinese workers, wages in Shenzhen seemed fantastically high. From all over the south, people poured into the zones looking for jobs.
Most people had to wait a year or two to get a job, but I got one just a month after I applied. It was hectic to start work right away because I was expecting a baby. But I couldn't miss this opportunity. Many people tried to get to Shenzhen, but not all of them made it here. If you worked full-time, you had a stable income and bonuses were good. Living standards went up. For example, we got a television and then we bought a color one to replace the black and white. We followed the fashions and didn't want to fall behind. So the changes were dramatic.
Economic growth spread throughout southern China. In the early 1980s, most foreign investors were from nearby Hong Kong and Taiwan, where millions of Chinese had fled communist rule. Hong Kong, the booming center of international business, was also one of the last remnants of British colonial rule. At the end of the 19th century, the British had forced the Chinese to lease them most of Hong Kong's territory for 99 years. In the early 1980s, investors began to worry about what would happen when the lease expired in 1997. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing in 1982 to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping.
The Prime Minister spoke about the treaties, the Treaty of 1842 and the Treaty of 1860, which gave us certain areas of Hong Kong. And this didn't go down too well. Deng said that there could be no question of the Chinese allowing Britain to run the place. The Chinese government couldn't face its own people if that happened. He added that if there was trouble in Hong Kong before 1997, then perhaps the Chinese would have to move in before that. And that provoked very heated exchanges.
I remember during the meeting, one senior official said, "This is Iron Lady meeting Iron Man."
In a way, each one was involuntarily impressed by the other. Deng wasn't accustomed to dealing with someone as tough as Mrs. Thatcher. And she, for her part, was certainly daunted by him because he was someone from a quite alien political experience. You realize that that was the end of the line when Deng had spoken. That was it. There was no appeal. He exuded authority.
For months, in discussions fraught with profound cultural differences, the English and Chinese negotiated.
It won't do anyone any good if this very flourishing Hong Kong that has been built up is destroyed. It's in China's interest to keep it. It's in investors' interest the world over to keep it. Above all, it's in the interest of the people of Hong Kong to keep it.
Finally, Deng Xiaoping proposed the idea of one country, two systems, and broke the impasse. China would recover Hong Kong, but the territory would keep its capitalist economic system. In 1984, Mrs. Thatcher returned to Beijing to sign the joint declaration, the agreement which would return Hong Kong to China in 1997.
The champagne glasses clinked and the cameras rolled and many nice things were said. And they reflected a mood of goodwill, genuine goodwill. The Chinese, I'm sure, felt great pride in having ensured the recovery of this bit of national territory. And Deng particularly would feel it because he was doing something that even Mao couldn't do or didn't do.
For the Chinese, Deng's recovery of Hong Kong erased the last humiliating legacy of 19th century colonialism. And it signaled China's growing power as a major player on the world stage. Conservatives in the party responded to Deng's successes with mixed feelings. The money-oriented lifestyles of Hong Kong and the special economic zones went against everything their revolution stood for.
Shenzhen really was different from inland areas. The young people there just wanted to get rich. They didn't care at all about the future of the country. Beijing sent people to make speeches about socialist values, but the young people wouldn't listen. They shouted that they wanted to ask questions, and they didn't want to listen to that stuff.
As social controls loosened, people moved around more freely. Smuggling, profiteering, prostitution, and pornography all reappeared. Hardliners blamed the rising crime on Deng's reforms and decadent foreign influences. In 1983, Deng moved to appease the conservatives' anger. He allowed the first campaign of the post-Mao era, an assault on spiritual pollution.
It came very fast, with a fierce start. This upset and frightened people.
Some schools asked young students to take part in the campaign. Those students ran home to grab their parents' wedding photos, their mother's lipsticks or perfumes, and gave them to their teachers, saying they had spiritual pollution at home.
The focus on appearance was reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. But now people found the targets absurd.
There were inspections in some army units. One soldier was discovered with a book with a picture of a foreign woman in a very low-cut dress. This picture was confiscated as spiritual pollution. But later, when people looked at it more closely, they realized it was Karl Marx's wife. There were a lot of stories like this.
I think that people in the north took it more seriously than most of us in Guangdong. Maybe that reflects the difference between the north and south. Northerners thought, oh, you people in Guangdong, living near Hong Kong, you've been under foreign influences.
Even though many Chinese did not take the campaign seriously, it frightened foreign investors.
Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang sensed the problem. So they issued a few instructions. For example, the movement was not to be carried out in the countryside, so it wasn't. Then they said there wasn't any spiritual pollution in the economic sphere, so it wasn't carried out there either.
After a few months, the campaign fizzled out. The party redirected the movement to a major crackdown on crimes like smuggling. Thousands of criminals were arrested, quickly tried, and executed. In January 1984, Deng personally signaled that economic reform would continue. He traveled to the special economic zones in a highly publicized trip. He made up a joke which revealed how he felt. Karl Marx sits up in heaven and he's very powerful. He sees what we are doing with socialism, and he doesn't like it. So he's punished me by making me deaf. Deng was in fact deaf in one ear, but his point was clear. His reforms looked far more capitalist than Marxist. In a move that would transform China's coast, the government opened most of it to foreign investment. And 14 more cities were designated freewheeling special economic zones. Outside the cities, China's peasants were better off than they had ever been. By the mid-1980s, much of rural China was booming. Families farmed on their own. They earned cash selling their surplus produce. In towns throughout China, markets reappeared for the first time in decades.
My youngest brother graduated from junior high. One day during summer vacation, he came home and said, "I'm going to the market to sell vegetables tomorrow." We said, "Are you kidding? How will you do it? Won't you be embarrassed?" When I came home in the evening, I saw my brother coming back. He said, "I made more than $3 today." I couldn't believe he had made so much money.
The entrepreneurial spirit seemed to have caught everyone. Families built up their own private sidelines to earn extra cash. In villages like this one in Anhui, which had faced starvation only 5 years earlier, even party officials became businessmen. They set up small collective factories. They made simple goods, bricks, pots, shoes, and matches, which had been in short supply for decades.
The local government asked me about making lamps, if I had the courage to start a new venture. I said I didn't know anything about this kind of work, but the government told me not to worry. They said that the responsibility would be taken collectively. So I thought, why not? I threw myself into it. At the beginning, we concentrated on small lamps, just for the domestic market, not for export overseas.
The rural factories began to fuel the national economy, with growth rates of more than 20% a year. And they provided jobs for the peasants, allowing them to earn more money than they had ever dreamed. People spent it equipping their houses with televisions, electric fans, and refrigerators, luxuries unthinkable under Mao. With their new prosperity, villagers had leisure time to look beyond their immediate needs. returned to traditional religious practices, long banned under Mao Zedong. They worshipped Buddha as well as local deities. In Shenjiali, villagers prayed to the Old Father God.
We always believed in him. Even during the Cultural Revolution, people secretly believed in him. When Chairman Mao was alive, his horoscope was very powerful and the gods did not dare come out. Then, because Mao died, Buddha and the gods came back.
When I went to the countryside, I really felt a sense of freedom. Under Mao, people had to work in the fields every day. If you wanted to visit relatives or friends, you had to ask for leave. Now they could use their time freely. It was like the end of slavery, the same feeling as if they had been freed from slavery.
In October 1984, the Communist Party celebrated its 35th year in power.
We 把进行社会主义现代化建设放在一切工作的首位。我们的经济获得了空前的蓬勃发展，其他工作也都得到了公认的成就。今天，全国人民无不感到兴奋和自豪。
The scene was really moving. I think this was when he was the most popular. His prestige was at its height. Everyone was very happy and wanted him to strengthen his leadership of China.
When the students and faculty of Beijing University marched past, we saw a special banner that said, "Hello, Comrade Xiaoping." It was obvious that they had made it spontaneously, and they were not marching in a very formal way like the others. They were trying to express their affection for Deng Xiaoping. They had great hope in him. They hoped he would lead China on the road to glory and prosperity.
But the hopes of the young people were very different from Deng's. Before long, the soaring expectations he had created would turn into a nightmare, threatening not just his leadership, but the power of the party itself.
We now continue.